So let's talk US-Israeli relations, because I feel like some of the problems that Israel is having to work through currently are being made a lot more fraught by the current administration in the US and prevailing left-wing thought emanating from across the Atlantic. So what's the context? The context is that under Trump you had one of the most pro-Israel US administrations in recent history. The US embassy was moved to Jerusalem. The Golan Heights was recognized as Israeli land, Israeli territory. And so you had perfect or close to perfect alignment between the US and Israeli administrations. Now obviously since 2020, you've had a Democrat administration led by Biden. That's arguably the most left-wing administration in the US for decades. And this has created a situation where you have uneasy dance partners between the left-wing administration in the US and the right-wing administration here in Israel. So still allies, they'll always be allies no matter which governments are in power, but not the same alignment as you say had under Trump. Now the current big issue that Israel is having to work through is the prospect of judicial reforms. So in Israel, the Supreme Court is, again, arguably one of the most powerful, influential Supreme Courts in the world. Governments' legislation or policies that they campaigned on can quite easily be overturned by the Supreme Court in a way that they can't as regularly be overturned in the US or, say, UK systems. And so for a number of years, perhaps decades, there has been this discussion that although it's important to have a Supreme Court and to have checks and balances around a democratic system, the Supreme Court shouldn't be able to heavy-handedly prevent or disrupt a elected government's program from being implemented. So what I expect would happen in a situation where both administrations were aligned is that you'd have this sane, mature conversation around, okay, what are the differences between the US system and the Israeli system? Has the US system got the checks and balances right? How do the powers of the Supreme Court in the US compare to the powers of the Supreme Court in Israel? So, I mean, there are interesting conversations and questions to be had and questions to be discussed. But instead, what you have is weeks and weeks and weeks of these protests. The media is gleeful. You have commentators from across the US saying that these attempts to reform the judicial system are fascism and the end of democracy and an attempt to install a dictatorship here in Israel. And it's all just complete and utter nonsense. But it's not being corrected by the opposition here, and it's not being corrected by the administration in the US, who seems quite happy for the right-wing government here to have to deal with all of these problems and protests and media just covering this issue 24/7. So I'm sure it would be very, very different if there was a Republican administration in the US. And you have to deal with reality, and the fact is there isn't. Hopefully, in my view, hopefully there will be in 2024. But until then, I think the government and the coalition here just has to be wary that there are a lot of strange things happening over the Atlantic in the US. There are a lot of strange things that happened in 2020. Big tech companies are censoring speech and massively promoting the issues that they support while massively dampening and censoring the issues they don't. there are a lot of issues that need to be sorted out in the US, and so it is irritating, and it is irritating to observe a similar playbook to what happened in 2020 with BLM race riots and social media censorship and social media like whipping the population up into hysteria over things that aren't anywhere near as controversial as they should be. That playbook to be repeated in a supposedly independent nation from the US doesn't sit right with me, and I think although they won't admit it, I think it's irritating the current government and current coalition here in Israel, because there are a lot of strange things happening. There are a lot of, I don't know. A conversation that needs to be had around judicial reforms is being blown into something absolutely crazy that it just isn't. And there are at least a few US administration fingerprints and big tech fingerprints over what's happening here.